Business is simple. It's just not easy. We focus on three things to help you run and grow your business more easily: talent, sales, and how to scale. This is the Talent, Sales, and Scale Show.
Hey everyone, Bryan Whittington with my guest today, Jeff Furst. This is a cool guy here. He's gonna be too humble, but this cat knows his stuff. So he was the founder and president CEO of First Person, which was a successful exit to Outmatch, and he's now hanging out with Outmatch as their vice president of strategic partnerships, and he knows his stuff. So what we're going to be talking about today is all things hiring. And a lot of us, we've been talking about sales enablement tools and marketing enablement tools and all of that good stuff. And unbeknownst to us, holy cow, they have like hiring enablement tools to help us go through this path. So the topic of the conversation today is getting from Jeff Furst, insights about hiring experience or having a whole HR stack. So with that said, welcome to the show, Jeff.
Well, thanks, Bryan. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we start off with the first question is, all right, so you had a successful exit. So what? So you've been doing this for like a million years. Why should we listen to you?
Yeah, it's a fair question. Maybe some of your listeners don't want to, but no, I mean, I think it's, experience counts, right? So I've had the fortunate opportunity to work with a lot of really successful large companies and small companies. And over the years, just kind of go back to what you mentioned around hiring enablement and how do you do a better job of identifying your job and the requirements to go in that job and how do you hire somebody for that. So I think what I can offer to the group that's tuning in or listening would be been there, done that. So a lot of mistakes that we've made and seen in working with customers. Flip side of that, a lot of success stories. So what worked really well, and it doesn't matter the size of business, could be small, medium, or large. There's different approaches we can certainly talk about around those. So I think those kind of experiences and that background, and having worked with a great team of people over the years, and certainly a great team here at Outmatch now.
Yeah, well, so we spend all of this money and time on sales enablement tools and marketing enablement tools. And we constantly hear out there that my people or our team is the most important, right? And my belief is, and that's why this is called the Talent, Sales, and Scale Show, Jeff. My belief is that your talent, your team is the only thing that can't be ripped off. I can rip off your technology. I can rip off your logo. I can rip off your messaging, even your ideas. I mean, you're just sharing me what's going on with Slack and Clubhouse, for goodness sakes.
Yeah.
Anything can get ripped off. But when it comes to team, that is the only differentiator that we really have that's unique in my impression. So I don't know if you'd agree with that or not.
100%. I mean, when you think about, you're right. I mean, you can only protect your intellectual property to a certain extent, but it's especially in today's world of software, it's hard to, a good idea is going to get copied and replicated over and over, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's innovation, and that's okay. But it's I think for companies to be successful, it truly is figuring out what is about that company that's going to be unique, and the jobs that you have, and the type of culture, and can you attract the right people to fit into that organization so that you can have a chance of success. Nothing's guaranteed, but if you do a good job identifying the right people, getting them hired, and then coaching them and developing them on a go-forward basis, you have a better shot at than not, right? And I think historically, I think one of the challenges has also been about the kind of the C-suite, right? So that chief human resource officer, this is kind of my opinion in a way, but based on just observations over the years, that CHRO really, I don't think had the same kind of status within the organization. And I'm talking a little bit larger companies now versus, let's say, a smaller company. But they didn't have the same stats because they didn't have the information they could bring. You think like that COO who's bringing all the operational data to the table, or the CFO has all the ROI investment data, or the CTO or CIO has all the tech data. Well, HR shows up, and what are they talking about? Well, they haven't talked about how they're moving the needle on hiring the right people. They haven't talked about how they have like a data-driven hiring process and stuff. So all these hiring enablement tools now allow that HR leader to have those conversations and put that data in front of the other executives and kind of hold their own. And that now, even because the cost of those tools is so affordable, it trickles down to those mid-sized companies and those small companies that you can have those same conversations and have the same kind of tools. So it's definitely a huge advancement for people over the last 10 plus years. I've been doing it longer than that. So I've seen even more change, especially on technology. But I think you're absolutely right that it goes back to your fundamental premise, which is getting the right people identified and hired is the way to start to build that success, and you keep that team. And companies change, right? I mean, your business changes, it matures, you have a different skill set you need. You identify that, and you have to obviously go back to the drawing board from a hiring perspective. But getting the right people on the bus, so to speak, is what allows you to be successful.
Yeah. So, and this is, I guess, one of the frustrations, and one of the reasons I wanted to start this podcast is I'm seeing it even right now, is that when we discuss talent, people don't care. I mean, well, I got to talk to so-and-so and get a committee of 7,000 people to then pitch it and repitch it. It's out of the budget. Is it just lip service that we're doing, that our team is the most important? I mean, what is that all about? Because you've been doing this for a while. Why do you think, I'll ask that question first and then I'll follow up, but why do you think that's happening? Is they don't seem to have that same level of relevance at the table, like you said.
Right. Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, one thought that I've seen over the years, or kind of maybe a conclusion I've come to, is it's almost like, you hire the wrong person and it's death by 1,000 cuts, right? So think of sales, right? So I'm a salesperson, I'm chasing a big deal. I win the deal, I lose the deal, right? So it's obvious to everybody. If I lose it, what's the problem with, why do we lose it? Is it product? Is it the salesperson's capability? Price? It's easy to do a deep dive and kind of
price of market all the time, right?
Of course, it always is, right? Exactly. It's always, yes. I'll tell some other story about that later. But you can figure that out. If you win the deal, then of course it's a salesperson, right? They're a rock star and absolutely crushed it. Blew the competition out. Hopefully they're hired using the tools we're talking about. But but I think when you look at talent and you look at all the ways cost leaks out of the organization, you don't have like that plain obvious, the example I gave with sales, right? Here's this lost opportunity. Everybody sees it on your weekly, sales forecast call. It's plain and obvious. Oh my gosh, what happened, right? When you look at turnover, you have turnover, it leaks out in 50 different ways, right, within the business. Our cost of a bad hire impacts it in 50 different ways, and you don't have a income statement that captures all those costs specifically. They're hidden under all these items and such. So good organizations have figured out, that are trying to get to a data-driven model, start to identify that. They can put those costs together. They start to measure what is that, bad hiring or underperforming talent costing them. But organizations that haven't done that, Brian, I think are really struggling with how, back to your point, they don't have the right executive view on it, and therefore they're not making the right investments. I think that is changing a lot, especially for mid-sized to larger companies, but I think it's that visibility aspect that's missing.
So do you think it's a visibility that they can't tie the direct cost? Because we see it all the time. I mean, I have 2 books in front of me, that top grading, where they talk about it's 3 to 10 times the annual revenue. It's hundreds of thousands of dollars. Is it because it's, like you said, that hidden cost that people don't get it? It's almost like a delayed, instead of delayed gratification, it's delayed hidden cost.
In a way, I think it's probably not being met. I mean, those are certainly, Top Grading is a great book and certainly has, some really strong concepts that can be helpful to anybody that picks that book up and reads it. But I think the problem with, you take that to the level that you're dealing with within your business, how are you actually measuring that locally, right? So are you capturing data and you're actually building your own business case? So you actually see, oh yeah, I had these 3 people leave. Well, these were 3 top performers, and by them leaving, what's that opportunity cost hanging out in my business now because they're not here anymore, right? Yeah. So now I have to onboard 3 people. There's a learning curve. What does that really cost me? So to me, it's really, it's easy to read about and say, oh, yeah, it's expensive. But when you actually, like anything else, when you actually get in and we'll try to calculate that cost within your own organization, then all of a sudden it's like, holy cow, this is super expensive. I need to fix this, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of one thought I have. I mean, there's probably others, that address that, but I think that's one that we certainly have seen.
How about, do you think another reason potentially may be, sheesh, I don't know, like, I don't know why that person didn't work, or this person isn't working out. The last 7 haven't either. So
Right.
I'm apprehensive, or I'm just apt to put up with the devil I know rather than a devil I don't. Is there any of that you think going on?
Absolutely. Well, that's if we kind of peel that back, now move away from kind of the what's this problem costing me to how do I actually, how am I hiring people today, and maybe what's wrong with the approach I have and what can I do to fix it. So a lot of companies struggle around just figuring out, well, what is the job? How do I define the job? Why is somebody successful in the job? Why are they not successful in the job? And so that job fit component, and then there's kind of this company fit component. And a lot of organizations really struggle with how to measure that or even set that up. So for example, if you just, we're talking about sales, so let's take a sales job to keep it, simple. It's also one of your themes. So a sales role, well, what goes into that type of sales role, right? Well, what's the type of sale you have? Is it a high-end, expensive, long sales cycle, enterprise consultative sale? Or is it a high volume, quick churn, you can sell it in 5 minutes on the phone, if you get the right, kind of cadence going, or there's somewhere in between? Well, those are all different sales models and different value propositions, and they take the jobs, somebody who's successful in that high volume, quick hit, environment isn't going to necessarily transfer over to a B2B enterprise consultative sales model. No, I'm not saying they couldn't, right? Especially somebody who's young, who starts out in that role and then gets better and training and progresses. That certainly is a career path as possible. But in general, those jobs are very different. For example, those consultative jobs, a lot more problem solving capability and other types of motivational behavior. I mean, those sales can sometimes take 6 to 9 months. Well, can I stick with this for 6 to 9 months and not go crazy, losing my mind that why aren't these people buying, right? And the constant, oh, we have a new decision maker coming in. What? You got to be kidding me. This is the 4th one, right? What happened? So it takes a certain type of understanding how to deal with that versus the, let's say that quicker type approach where it's, how do I get what they're looking for, get it in front of them, get the value, negotiate it, and boom, get the deal done, right? And so so there's a different, kind of, you think about what we call competencies, or kind of those abilities and motivations and so on and so forth that kind of create success. Well, how do you define the job that way? And then measuring that in the candidate is a whole other, animal, right? So that's another area to think about.
Yeah, so let's unpack this a little bit more. So those that aren't familiar with maybe the terminology of competency, right? There's a number of different competencies, and I kind of get the idea, but define that for us. How would you define competencies for a job fit?
Sure. So I think there's certainly a lot of formal definitions, and you're right. I mean, in any given competency model, there might be 100 different competencies or 50 different competencies, and it kind of depends. So the way just a simple framework, and this isn't necessarily maybe an industrial organization psychologist wouldn't necessarily say, well, this is the correct way to say it, but I typically would try to keep it simple. I'm not an industrial organizational psychologist, right? So I keep it on my level that I can understand. But you think about kind of like workability, you think about work motivation, you think about work skills. So workability is kind of that, cognitive mental capability. So a good one we always talk about is problem solving. So do I have the ability to, solve problems, learn information, apply that information on the job? And that can be, translated into a number of different areas. Work motivation is more about that behavioral, component, right? So am I driven to achieve? Am I curious about different things? Am I conscientious and thinking about, the welfare of the other people I'm dealing with? Those factors and those scales are important to, jobs, and there's different kind of ranges, which we can talk about later, on those. And then work skills is more like, things like the job skills that are needed. And I don't mean like skills like, yeah, I can use Word or Microsoft Excel or Zoom, those kind of things. Those can all
Right.
be learned. It's really more like, a good one would be multitasking, certain jobs, whether it's, you're using certain technology a lot, a contact center job, for example, where you're moving from system to system or screen to screen, or I might be a field technician and I have to pay attention to the work I'm doing, and maybe a tech tool that's aiding me, in that work, or I'm working in a factory and there's multiple things happening, right? So like multitasking might be a job skill that you'd want to measure. And I think one of the key things just to point out is sometimes those competencies are hard to measure, right? And it's hard to pick up in an interview. So for example, think about measuring work motivation. Well, you have to ask a lot of like behavioral questions with anchors to try to get a sense of what was the history of this person and their job performance. But people are smart, right? So they know the questions you're asking, they understand the answers you're looking for. So sometimes, those interviews it's not as easy as what I'm trying to say through an interview to pick that out. So those competencies can range, and you have different competencies that are important in different jobs. There's literally, pages and books and all sorts of things, developed to describe that. But I think, just kind of give you a sense, high level, how that can play out.
Now, would it be fair to say, because I don't want to overly simplify this, but competencies are made up of a bunch of behaviors? Is that an accurate statement?
It's a little bit more than behaviors. I mean, behaviors be a component to that.
Okay.
So you might have other things like ability to learn, for example, which is more of it's not necessarily a behavior. Now, there's a combination of I have the ability to learn, so I can learn, but do I want to learn, right? So those are two very different things. So there's a lot of people in the world, like we see it in testing data all the time, when you talk about like a cognitive ability assessment. So you're measuring, where they, do they have enough mental horsepower to do the work? And that ranges, right? I mean, certain jobs, it's pretty low. You get into like a rocket scientist, yeah, you need a little bit more than maybe a customer service person. So I think the way to kind of think about it though is do I have enough to be able to do this? So that can I do the job? And then the next thing is, will I do the job? We see testing data that shows a lot of people have the ability can do the job, but they're not willing to do the job, right? So they're not willing to that kind of motivational wrapper around it. They're just not willing to do. They won't show up on time. They'll, no call, no show. There's behavioral issues around their performance. And again, that's a small subset, but that is a common issue that you run into. You really need to understand both, right? So when you're thinking about your job and can you break it down into both that can do and that will do, it makes a huge difference.
Okay. Now, and you're suggesting that you have ways of finding out not only can they do it, but will they do it?
Absolutely. So there's a variety of different types of assessment tools out there that become helpful. You mentioned obviously that I'm part of Outmatch now, which is an organization that has a hiring experience stack that really focuses on not only the assessment component, but also other components around interview and reference checking, and kind of brings it all under one technology component that allows us to make it very easy. So just to kind of highlight a few examples there. So there's a tool we call Automatch Assess, which helps to measure that behavioral component. So that's a specific assessment designed with questions and answer keys to help you evaluate, how is a candidate performing in that particular, or how does a candidate measure in those particular areas? And there's a series of competencies and traits. Go ahead.
Yeah, let me pause you there. So I know there's a whole lot of different flavors of assessments out there. Some are personality, some
Right.
are, it seems like even the personality ones profess not to be personality ones. So like, what is it that we're truly measuring, and what should we be looking at if we choose an assessment how do we decide which assessment tool do we go after?
Yeah. So first, I think this could be how much time do we have? But so I think if you first go back to kind of that framework I discussed, right? So that workability, work skills, work behavior. So understanding your job in those, how it kind of breaks down in those three buckets is a great little very simple framework, but it's a good way to kind of position it. And then there's tools that are good at measuring those different buckets, right? So personality or a behavioral assessment around the work motivation, that's a great way to do it, right? It's going to be more reliable than an interview, and it's designed to measure that kind of outcome. A cognitive ability task, which could be like numerical reasoning or abstract reasoning or other types of variations, is a great way to measure that work ability, right? And then there's also some specific things you can get into, like situational judgment tests and those kind of things. But there are, I think the key is to understand, first understand the job and kind of how you would break down those different sections. And then there's different types of tools or tasks that can be used to measure those specific things. Then you get into the question, well, which ones are good ones and which ones aren't so good, right? And that's
where I was going to ask you, because you said, how do they compare to others? Because I know some assessments out there, they just do personalities, don't assess it to anyone. They just say, here you go. And those are curious, because you go, yeah, that's me. But it really can't tell you much about anything other than that's me. Whereas other ones will profess that, hey, you can make your own job scores up, or you can figure out your own role. But then what am I comparing that to? How do I know if I'm comparing it to the accuracy? And if I'm just starting up, do I take the best people on my team? And then there's others that compare them against the universe. So I guess looking at those, I'm probably missing others, but those are the three that I know about. I mean, how do we know, like, what's the best approach that we should take here, I guess?
Yeah. When we talk about hiring and using tools, and a tool could be a task, it could even be an interview, right? There are important requirements to understand. And a great resource is to, for anybody who's interested, it's not the most exciting read, but if you go out to the Department of Labor, just Google uniform guidelines on hiring, right?
I was just reading that last night. It was,
no, you couldn't sleep, it's 1 a.m. That'll cure it every single time. So it's not, it's not super long, but it is truly kind of boring, but it does kind of give you a sense of, here's what the government says you should be thinking about when you are actually hiring. And not to step on the third rail around, opinions and politics and stuff like that, but it is actually, when you think about the government, it actually is that uniform guideline documentation actually does outline a fairly good best practice when it comes to it, right? So believe it or not, it actually is practical in the real business world to read that and understand it. So from a compliance standpoint, there's a lot of boxes you have to check, when we go through these types of tools. So there's some things though that you should be asking when you're, if you are going to get to the point where, okay, now I'm going to use assessments or even my own interviewing, I should be thinking about how I'm actually documenting interviewing and measuring it, because an interview could be just as biased, and maybe even more biased than an assessment tool, right? Because we're bringing our own opinions to the table. We think this is what the job looks like. We think this is why this person should be successful, but we don't do a very good job of that, right? So common way to think about is look at the draft, right? Right now we're talking about the NFL draft coming up. It's end of March and the draft's in a couple of weeks. And think of all the misses, that organizations have around that. Yeah. It's the same concept, right? So when we talk with organizations about, well, why should you consider using Outmatch? Well, there's a couple themes that we talk about. One could be, well, the test needs to be reliable. So that means that you get the same kind of result over and over with different populations. So, and there should be data that the creator of that assessment can share with you and show you and talk about, right? One thing, just to go backwards a little bit, that's really important is when we talk about assessments, these are not like clinical type tools that are being used. Somebody might have a mental illness or some type of mental disability from that standpoint. These are job related, only focused on determining if you are a good fit for the job, and you can defend the use of the test around job measurement. So there's a lot of specific things that we do want to, caution about and be careful about, from that perspective. So reliability tool, meaning, hey, you can deploy it to different populations over and over, and you're going to get pretty much the same results every single time, right? So that's really important. Another thing that needs to happen or should have happened at some point is what they call validation. So validation is where you look at the scores on the assessment and some type of performance outcome. So that could be turnover, it could be a job performance, but it's something that's important to the business, where if you had to say, hey, if I'm running the business and I measure the business, this is an important metric. Okay, so let's go back to our sales example. Well, deals won, per opportunities or something like that, or dollars collected per opportunities or a quota, that's how you're evaluating the sales team. It's critical to the business, performance. You can justify that metric. So ideally, if you're hiring somebody using assessments for sales, you want to show the relationship between how they score in the assessments to better sales outcomes, right? And if there's a relationship there, that means the test is doing what you want it to do. And then there's a whole bunch of statistical stuff that I'm not qualified to really get into that you want to understand. One of the things that's important for the audience to really get to, though, is there's sample size concerns, right? Because larger companies have a certain advantage because they have a lot of people doing the same job, or they have a lot of people doing the job. So it's a little bit easier to do these types of validation studies. When you're a smaller organization, you should be talking to the vendor about, what have they done with other organizations and how can that be used for my environment? Because I'm only hiring 10 people a year. I can't do a statistically valid study, right? So there's different trade-offs and conversations you want to have around that. That's where things like the technical manual from that vendor might be of help, or they should be able to walk you through studies they've done with other organizations to give you that confidence that, yeah, this is a test designed for hiring people for job specific purposes, and they've done this before, it's reliable, and I can document why it's a good fit for my organization.
Okay, so I'm going to bring it back up a couple of levels there. So that was good stuff. So if you're looking at using assessment tools, these are all things that you're going to want to watch out for and read this stuff, or give it to your HR person to figure all of this stuff out. Right?
Ideally, yeah.
Yeah. Now, but let's go back to, okay, so we're utilizing this. So we've been talking a lot about the assessment side of it, but then there's a whole entire enablement side to the talent management, talent acquisition, recruiting, hiring, whatever we want to call it. So let's talk a little bit about that. When we originally started this, you had said, hey, there's a lot of data in this that we're now bringing data to the table. So let's start there and then go through what would be an ideal process or stack, or we'll go a little bit more deeply into that. So let's talk about what type of data should we be gleaning from these things or looking for. How do we use data in this part? Sure.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Brian. I mean, there's a ton of data that's available, not only from the assessments and that kind of thing, but also from a process, right? So let's I'll just point out a couple examples that might make sense, and stuff hopefully people can use in their own business right away. So let's talk about, okay, I'm top of the funnel, I'm trying to recruit a whole bunch of people, or even just one person, right? It doesn't matter, right? I mean, it's amazing how many candidates you have to start with, to go get one person. So
do you have just a quick aside there, do you have any sense, I have an idea in my mind, but any sense of top of the funnel? And by the way, notice that language, it's just like sales and marketing.
Exactly. Yes.
Yep. So top of the funnel, how many people do I typically need to apply to get one good hire? Any sense? Is there any commonality there?
I don't know that there's any commonality because the jobs are so different, right? I mean, and think about the population available. So if I'm like an hourly, kind of role, and I'm hiring for like a retail position or a restaurant position, or maybe a customer service type role within a contact center, so large populations doing the same kind of work, then maybe you need 4 to 5 candidates to get your one hire.
Okay.
Unless you're doing a work at home, or you can do work at home, then you probably can get more candidates, get your one hire, right? You tend to have a little bit more of a selection capability. When you're getting to like roles that are, there's just shortages of those people. It could be, a data scientist, or a really good enterprise salesperson, or programming talent. On the flip side, you think of like a lot of home services, so plumbers and other types of technicians, mechanics, to work on. You can't find those people, right? And so, so if you own like a HVAC business, you might be killing yourself trying to get, a tech that you can hire that has the appropriate skills. especially if you're in a community where there's a lot of other HVAC businesses trying to do the same thing, right?
Yeah.
Because a lot of those people have retired and such. But so it's hard to say, I think, a general ratio. I think it's going to depend on the specificity of the requirements to do the work and the population available for that. Again, lower level, high volume positions, I'd say probably 5 to 1, 4 to 1, maybe even 3 to 1 if you're not super worried about the quality. But those other kind of positions that people who are listening to this might be hiring for, so it's harder to say.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and so you were saying at the top of the funnel, we're looking at that. So I took you off
No,
there.
that's okay. Yeah.
Yep.
So just think about your funnel, and ideally you're measuring each of the stages through that funnel. And so, but you spent dollars to get that person to the top of the funnel. You're gonna say something?
I was going to ask, can you talk us through what are maybe some recommended stages there?
Sure. Yeah. And again, you can make this as simple as or complex as you want, right? So in most of the examples we have within Outmatch and companies we work with, usually so you have your recruitment marketing at the top of the funnel. You probably have an applicant tracking system that they go to next, right? So it links right into the applicant tracking system. They're creating their profile and their application, and then they get routed to an assessment layer, or our kind of what we would call our hiring experience stack, right? So that's where we're going to take them through maybe a quick little pre-screen, behavioral assessment. Let's pretend there's a simulation involved, and then we push them to an interview tool where they can record an interview, and then we push them to a reference checking process, and then they come back into the ATS, the applicant tracking system, for additional discussions within the recruiting team, right? So you would have different stages. So I think at a high level, you have kind of your recruiting layer, then you have your system of record layer, then you have your candidate qualification layer, and then you have your onboarding layer, right? And then they're hired, and now they move into some other system. So
it's kind of like, all right, top of the funnel. So you're doing top of the funnel, exploratory call, pipeline management,
exactly.
Legal, going back and forth for the offering, legal, and then onboarding.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is, in my opinion, if you want to have a good recruiting operation, you should read different sales books. You should understand CRM systems. You should understand sales pipeline and workflow management, because it all is directly applicable to funnel management recruiting. You have the same problem. So how do I attract people? How do I convert them, candidate from stage to stage? It's the same thing, right? And it's just a matter of, there's certainly some requirements around, the evaluation of the candidate is different than the sales, prospect. There's different tools, but it's still the same thing, right? You're converting from step to step to step.
Yeah. Now, okay, so we have all these tools. Now, ATS would be equivalent to a CRM. That applicant tracking system is basically a
Right.
CRM for candidates. Now, you talked about, so the video piece. I want to touch on that because I look at that video piece as on-demand video interviewing, which is kind of taking the place of the telephone screen or the scheduling back and forth of, oh, you can interview? How about 4 o'clock? Okay, you're working then? How about, right? Instead of that whole rigmarole and taking calls at 7 o'clock at night because they don't want to, because the good people are currently employed right now. So that way you can actually talk to them whenever. It's kind of curious how many people are doing that in the car.
Yes, exactly right.
So they're doing it in the car. So you do that video on demand interview, but then you said simulation. What in the world is simulation? I mean, that sounds fun. I used to do flight simulators. What's simulation and hiring?
Well, it's the same concept, right? So simulations can be used to kind of create a experience for a candidate to play the part. And so here at Outmatch, for example, we have a series of simulations designed around contact center jobs, so that they can basically understand what does it mean to do that. And you're measuring different things. So I talked earlier about work skills, right? So multitasking or accuracy of inputting information. You can't measure that in an interview, right? And so how are you going to measure that? Well, a simulation is a way to do that. And there's other ways to kind of get at a simulation concept, right? So, for example, you could come up with a sales simulation that's purely non-digital, right? So you could create a scenario that you send to the candidate. and then they need to kind of pitch you on that scenario, and you can make up all that information, in terms of the assets they need and so on and so forth. And that's a way you could do a very, very bare bones kind of simulation around, selling if you wanted to. Now, is
So
it
we might call
validated?
that
No.
role play or something along those lines, right?
Role play, yeah, I'd say it's more of an advanced role play, right? Because you're requiring them to do a little prep work and homework and read information. So they've got to show you they paid attention to it, can learn that information, can apply it. Or another way is you could say, well, you pick a company you worked for and sell me that product, right? And what do you need to go through? So you want to give them the chance to go through those stages. For example, if you need a due diligence phase, give them a chance to have a brief due diligence conversation. It's all kind of made up, but it gives at least you're role playing that buyer, they're role playing as a salesperson, and it's kind of a very basic way to do it. Again, it's not been validated, it's not gone through a reliability analysis, but you're talking usually those cases like one-off hiring. I'm hiring 2 people a year or whatever, so you can make it work.
Okay, well, and so we do all of that, but then I guess what's the data that we should be looking at? So in a sales perspective, we're going to have KPIs along the way, like certain ratios,
right?
We're going to always try to improve the ratios. Is it the same whenever we're using these like a hiring stack? Well, let's go on paper, let alone with the hiring stack. Let's go paper. Should we just have KPIs and ratios at each stage then?
Yeah, so I think it goes back to kind of you have different data silos you want to understand, right? So if we go back to just the recruiting process, yes, you should be looking at what are my conversion rates at each point, and figure out what your funnel wants. Again, each person can design that funnel in terms of what stages they want, but you should understand, well, what is my fallout rate between the applicant tracking system and the assessment process, right? Am I converting 100%? Am I converting 10%, right? Because then you want to, just like sales, you want to dig into why is it what it is, right? So if it's a high number, great, less problems to worry about, but you still want to dig into it. If it's a really low number, well, now I paid all this money for all these candidates, and I'm not getting them through to the critical part, which is the evaluation phase. What's going on, right? So why am I losing them? Where am I losing them? So you have kind of that recruiting stack, that you want to, or that recruiting funnel, that you want to measure and understand. Another thing,
real quick clarity on that one. In sales, there's two sides of the coin, right? One side is qualify everyone, let's get them through, we need numbers, and the other side is disqualify everyone, we only want the best. When we're looking at recruiting, should we be looking to disqualify out? Like, because that's a really curious thing. If I'm trying to improve my metrics, I might be at the cost of quality. Or if there's a fine, I would think there's a fine balance there.
There is, and you have different the same thing as sales, right? You have different mindsets, right? So what we typically see is you have a lot of organizations where you want to move as many people. The funnel is designed to eliminate people, right?
Right.
And so, because at the end of the day, you have a finite team of recruiters with only so many hours in the day. So how can you use automation, like we call our hiring experience stack, to get to funnel or filter those candidates down to a more manageable number? So now I'm dealing with a smaller population that should be better qualified for the job, so I can focus more time and effort to convert those people to the opportunity, meaning hire them, right? And so that's kind of the mentality that a lot of these larger companies will do, is I have this huge funnel at the top, I'm gonna use much automation that's based on some type of predictive toolkit to get them to a much smaller population, where then my salespeople, otherwise known as recruiters, are gonna close, right? And so, but if I have too many people in that population, I don't have the bandwidth to cover it, right? Now, companies scale up and scale down, and so you have all sorts of anomalies that you have to deal with, but that's kind of how most of the organizations we talk to are doing that. And flip side, think of a small company, right? A small company can have the same problem. It's not a volume, it's still a volume problem. They don't have a team of recruiters, so I'm trying to hire 2 people to fill some office positions. I recruit out on some different websites, I get 500 people that respond. Well, how do I know? I can't talk to all 500 people, right?
Right.
So I need some way to filter that population down and do it in a way that's objective, consistent, based on some kind of job criteria, So it's the same thing. It doesn't matter if you're a large company or a small company, you still have the same problem. It's just the scale of that problem.
Yeah. Well, okay. So I go through this process, and so you talked about the top of the funnel. Now you don't have really anything to drive candidates. It's all once the candidates are driven. So whether I'm using an outside recruiter, an inside recruiter, I'm using a job board, it doesn't matter how they come to me.
Right.
That's where my engagement process is, right? So I'm not talking top of the funnel. You're really all of that vetting process to make that more effective. Is that
Yeah,
right?
where I've lived most of my, last 22 years is in that vetting process. Now, at First Person, we used to do recruitment process outsourcing and staffing. So I do have a good understanding of top of the funnel stuff, right? In other words, how do you
Right.
get people to show up at the front door, so to speak? So just a couple thoughts around that. But I will say one thing that companies should be doing is, if I'm a hiring manager, I should be looking at every source that I'm using, and I should be measuring the quality of that source, right? So it's just like sales again, or marketing in this case, right? So
Yeah.
where'd that lead come from? Was it the event I went to? Was it an online, webinar I did? Was it a asset that they downloaded off of our website? Was it a referral from another customer? No different, right? You have different ways that candidates are going to find you, just like a lead will find an organization. So, but what you want to then do is track that, and then you have some type of quality metric you're using on the back end once that person's been hired. Let's just make it up. They made it to 90 days. All right. So they made it to 90 days of employment. Well, which of my sources, how people found us, had the best got to 90 days return, right?
Interesting.
That's a
Yeah.
very, very simple way. Or which is the, here I've hired salespeople. What's my conversion rate? Which source is helping me get the best conversion rate? And that then helps you allocate your dollars from a recruiting spend, right? So now I might say, well, this recruiting source has the best quality, but they have the lowest quantity. So you want to balance quantity and quality. So now you can start to get into some kind of, can plot that out, and you can get a sense, okay, this job board is working really well for me. I'm getting a good mixture of quantity and good quality. So maybe I'll put more money behind that job board. Or I might go to this other source and I'm getting terrible quality. Maybe I want to beat them up on price and say, look, the data tells me you're not helping me, so why should I use you, right? So that's an important thing, I think, as you think about kind of just the investment that goes in and how to optimize the return on those dollars being invested. So
okay, so they come all through this, then they go to your assessment tool next, I think you said?
Yes, that's one option, right? So they come through that, then they would go through the hiring toolkit, and again, that's going to, there might be different levels or layers within that toolkit, but typically that would be the next step. Yes.
Okay, so we have them all come through all those different various ways. We have them go through the assessment. Are we looking at resume before we send them through the assessment? We just do assessment?
Yeah. I mean, the problem is resumes tend to have a lot of questions in them.
Made up stuff?
Made up stuff, exactly.
Yeah.
So I think and again, it comes back to the type of jobs, right? So where you have small populations of people doing relatively high, level work, you get like a data scientist or an engineer. Resumes in those cases can be kind of important because it does give you a sense of skills and experience and things that might be important to making sure you find somebody who comes from a certain environment, right, where they did certain type of work that's important to the type of work you want them to do. So I'm not saying resumes are just terrible and should never be looked at. And I think it's also important to talk about, it should never be a one size fits all from a process, right? So the process I was talking about, Bryan, is a little more geared towards higher volume, lots of, higher volume hiring, right? Because you want to automate some of that. If you're talking to a high level intellectual property attorney candidate, for your law firm, probably doesn't make sense to have that kind of process in place, right? Now, there you might want to have that initial outreach by somebody to have a conversation, kind of check a few boxes. And then you say, hey, part of our process is we use some assessments. It's going to take you 30 minutes to complete these. I'm going to send you a link. Please go through that. If you don't get it, let me know. Right. So you're you're hand-holding that the right way, so that that higher level candidate for a high level paying position doesn't feel like, oh, I've just been routed in like, everybody else in the world, right? So you have to understand there are nuances and things to think about, in terms of how, even within the same company, how you're hiring for different roles.
So to put this into a sales perspective, then do I have a self-service model where they can go to my website and get the shopping cart, right? Everything's fairly automated, to somewhere, account-based marketing where I'm really strategic on who I'm going after, like enterprise sale, account-based marketing. That's going to be the example that you just laid out, and something in between, right? So
exactly right. Yeah.
Okay. So
exactly.
I really need to know how, I guess that would go to also not only your company and volume, but also the level of position.
Correct. So for example, in our world at Outmatch, we can solve all those needs, right? So we can set up a high volume automated process where the candidate's really driving that experience. So that you think that journey, they're driving down and figuring out, I'm going to control what step I'm going to go to. You talk about recorded interviews, right? So it's a great way for a candidate to do that on their time at their convenience. And it can work quite well, especially if you have the right messaging around what's going to happen. Going to the other side, which is, I'm looking for a very specific type of talent, for a relatively hard to find role. I need that to be, the white glove kind of service where I have somebody who's kind of their ambassador, moving them from step to step. There's going to be some technology involved. I'm going to want them to take certain assessments, but I'm going to send those links out. I'm going to make sure they understand. If I do an interview, it's going to be a live interview kind of concept, because they're investing the time and those kind of things. Now, you can still use other technology. For example, you could record videos and send them, email, and somebody in the company saying, hey, Bryan, thanks for spending a few minutes, considering us. Really looking forward to having you meet the rest of the team. Those kind of things can be done to just kind of, again, create a little more of a human approach and make it a little more accessible for the individual, especially because they can look at that at any time then.
Yeah. Wow. I did not. So this is a lot more in depth than I was anticipating here.
Well,
oh my God.
Too many years doing it.
Yeah. So, okay. So kind of trying to tie this all together then. So if I'm a leader of an organization, whether a founder or whether, president, CEO of, large corporation ABC, my sense is, based upon today's conversation, we really need to take a better look at getting that CRO, that VP of people, talent, whatever we're calling them these days, getting them a space at the table if we genuinely believe that talent is a key differentiator. And then in order to give them the skill sets that they need, or the ability that they need, is give them the tools to be able to do this. Because what we didn't even hit on is, okay, we have a whole entire internal recruiting team, right? So we have that, but then they're also tying into the individual business units where we have hiring managers within those individual business units. So I'm guessing there's going to have to be better collaboration there. Now, your stuff wouldn't help with that, would it?
It does, right? I mean,
it does.
For example, getting consensus on a job, going back to, again, what are we measuring, right? Why are we who's the person we want to hire, and getting consensus around that. It's amazing sometimes at the differences you have. And so this is why, go back to your earlier point about, well, why is it broke? Why am I not able to hire the right people? Well, you have, let's say, 5 hiring managers across a medium-sized business. Each of them have their own definition of what they're looking for. So now, I'm the recruiter, and I go to, Joe, and Joe says, well, this is what I want. And then I go to Susie, and Susie wants this. And, then I go to Al, so you end up with all these different, kind of criteria. And now I'm totally confused because I don't know what my internal buyer needs, right? So that's where, when you kind of go through the discipline of talking about the job and defining the job and getting sign off on the measurement, now you have a model that you can measure and capture information around, and everybody's bought in. So you eliminate that variance, and that variance is what kills you, right? In terms of the differences of, in terms of hiring quality. So it never goes away 100% because we're dealing with people, but you can reduce it.
Well, I would think it would go to, now, does your stuff help with consistency across those hiring managers? Because just like a sales manager, you're going to have their varying degrees or different leadership styles, different management styles. Um, I would think a key part of this is going to be how often am I recruiting? So that's not necessarily going to be your space, but then once I do recruit them, how well am I interviewing them? How well is my hiring process? I would think that's where you're playing now. Can you help people interview well? Because that seems like, hey, you're a good manager. Good luck. Go hire some people, and
Right.
there's not a lot of help there.
No, exactly. I mean, interviewing is a tough thing, and we have some customers, for example, don't even interview because it's too hard to get reliability around that, and so they say it's just not worth it, right? So the results they're getting are actually detrimental to hiring quality. They would rather focus on using a series of assessments that are objective, that have been based on a calibrated against hiring performance, than actually have people get involved.
That boggles my head. So they're just using strictly assessments and all these things and nothing
Yeah.
else.
Yeah. Now they'll still do a
Holy
check-in. They'll still have a recruiter check-in and conversation and things like that. So it's not totally devoid of any human interaction from that
Yeah.
perspective. But they've just determined we're not doing a good job at interviewing. We don't train right. We don't have the right interviewing. Our team doesn't embrace it, and so we're actually worse off and maybe even creating more bias in the process by doing it that way than actually just having a series of assessments been validated, are checked for certain adverse impact type requirements, so on and so forth. So it's a very well documented process. It's anchored on job performance, and it works quite well.
Oh my gosh. Well, that just completely boggled my head. So with that mic drop, let's kind of wrap it down, because I can't believe how fast this time went. So I can't thank enough here, Jeff. So, I mean, looking at everything that we've been doing, you've been at this a couple of days, like you said. What are some the biggest challenges that you've seen as people are hiring? What mistakes have you seen others make, or maybe you've made, that you can share with us so we don't make the same mistake?
Yeah, it's there's a lot of different things I could point to, but I think in terms of just hiring in general, I think it goes back to really it's about the preparation of what is the job, how do I understand what I want, a year from now, how would I know this person's been successful, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's really taking time to break that down and understand in the measurement, and then documenting that, and then making sure my process lines up against that. So I can, say over the 20 plus years when we were running independent, the mistakes I made around hiring and not going through my, you think, geez, you'd be an expert at it, right? And unfortunately, no, nobody is. And so you kind of forget about, some of the things that you should be doing, and you make mistakes. And so every time kind of circumvented that process and didn't think about the role, didn't think about how we're going to be successful. So I think it just takes time, everybody should spend time around that. That's a key mistake I've made over the years. So I'd probably start there, Brian, sense of just go back to the basics and spend that time doing the prep work and understanding the role and how it fits in the business and what I want to measure, to make sure I'm getting the right person.
Got it. So set expectations and make sure that I'm following the process.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And don't deviate, because, you get caught up in, especially as a smaller company, you get caught up in, I think I've got this great candidate. Right. And so you're worried that they're going to take another position. So you move faster than what your process is telling you to move, and then you have problems. And so, so I think that's a key one. I'd say the other one that was, always a struggle on our side was just the coaching and ongoing development. When you're smaller, it's hard to do that. And if I could go back in time, there's probably some changes I would make around how we worked with the employees and maybe did a little bit more definitive coaching and other aspects. But you're 5 people or 10 people or even 20 people, even as you're growing, it's hard to do that. And you just have to kind of figure out, what that model needs to be. And I think sometimes that can be helpful too, because you get a good person in, and now you're really helping them, be the best they can, and making sure you have enough resources going into that.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. And then how about a business hack for, I suppose we use it on talent, sales, or scaling a business. What's one thing that any best advice there?
In terms of like how to be better at any of those?
Yeah,
Really,
just pick one though.
Yeah. Well, one, I think, partly you already said, right? don't think of HR as like boring administrative, that kind of stuff. Especially recruiting. Go to sales and marketing and learn from sales and marketing best practices, and anything that you can pick up there, figure out how to apply it to your recruiting process, and you'll be more successful the next day by doing that.
Interesting. I love that idea. I've not heard that before. Resources that you might recommend, books, podcasts, guides, so we can do better in the hiring process. And there's so much complexity in the hiring process. Anything that you might recommend?
Sure. Well, obviously your podcast, right? But
Hey, there you go.
well, that's without saying. So I would say, Outmatch has a resource section, and we publish articles there. I would say there's an organization that industrial organizational psychologists belong to called SIOP, so Society of Industrial Organizational Psychologists. I think it's SIOP.org.
Okay.
They have some really interesting articles written by usually PhDs in industrial psychology around hiring and tests, and you can learn a lot through that site. So I think that's one that might be interesting to check out and follow. And then I'd also say get on Twitter and maybe follow some different companies, that are out in the space that might be a little more research driven from that perspective. So, but there's an endless amount of information. Go back to uniform guidelines and read those, and kind of start with that.
Okay, great. I appreciate that. And then what are you watching? Future trends. I'm guessing hiring has fundamentally changed after this year of lockdown. What are you watching for? What do you see coming down the pike?
Yeah, well, the more things change, the more they stay the same, right? So I think what I've seen in the last 22 years doing this is you still have the tech. Let's how to put it. The ability of technology to accelerate the hiring process and provide more data and drop the cost. So now the smallest company can have the same kind of tools as the biggest company. So that's awesome, right? When you think about kind of that democratization of tools and enablement across any type of company. I think what we'll see going forward is continued consolidation around toolkits onto platforms, kind of like what we've done here at Outmatch, but then more data on outcomes. So how we link more data through all the different, you think of the employee life cycle, every life cycle stage, there's a data component, and how that data will start to come together in an overall model that will help us continue to do a better job of hiring the right person. But like I was talking about earlier, what I struggled with a little bit, which is that coaching development, looking at, is this person at risk to leave the organization, and then be able to come in with a, kind of that coaching intervention, or making sure you kind of figure out what's going on and solve for that. So more and more data in a connected way, done at a lower cost point, I think is what we're going to start to see.
Do you ever see AI being able to help out with that? There's so
I
many
didn't touch
data
AI
points.
because I didn't touch AI because there's a whole bunch of things there. So AI in hiring has gotten kind of there's kind of good side and bad side to it, right? So the bad side is the facial recognition around video interviewing and that kind of stuff, where there's just a whole slew of issues and bias that brings to the table. And it's interesting because it's really unfortunate, because the assessment space in general for 50 plus years, 60 plus years has been all about eliminating bias, right? Yeah. So it's really sad when a few people really don't understand how this stuff works, who are critical and say, well, AI is bringing bias. Well, actually, that's not the case, because these assessments are really built to do a better job of eliminating bias, more so than a traditional interview. Like if you do interviews and you're saying there's bias in tests, then you're kind of hypocritical from that standpoint, because interviews are loaded with bias, especially interviews that are done in a non-calibrated, trained behavioral way. So now the flip side is, where can it help? So for example, we were talking about recorded interviews. Like one of the things we do at Outmatch is we can transfer the audio, we can turn it into a text script, using just a simple tool, right? And then we can run a machine learning algorithm against the answers and help identify additional awareness on the candidate's potential success, right? So there's things we can do around that are lower risk, more of a traditional kind of assessment approach, if you will, from a statistical standpoint, reliability standpoint. So I think we'll see a continued evolution of that. And I think the other area would be more like with games, and we didn't talk at all about like adaptive testing or item response theory, where how you answer the one question delivers the next question. I think we'll see more of that, where you can get to a quicker resolution with the candidate.
Okay.
One of the themes around the candidate experience, letting the candidate drive, Brian, is faster, faster, faster. If I talked about even 5 years ago, a typical candidate experience might be 90 minutes. Now it might be 9 minutes, right? So exponentially improve the ability to get a similar predictive outcome, but a lot less time. And technology is letting us do that. So I don't know, we'll get down to 9 seconds, but but we're getting close, right?
Very interesting. I don't even know what you just said there, but that's super interesting. I'll have to study up on that stuff. Cool. Well, hey, listen, who should reach out to you, Jeff? How should they do it? And why should people reach out to you?
Sure. Obviously, love to talk to organizations that are, kind of struggling with these challenges. If there's companies that are, in the space and want to partner, feel free to reach out to me. So they can go to my LinkedIn profile. It's just Jeff Furst, F-U-R-C, or my email is jfurst, F-U-R-S-T, at outmatch.com.
Cool. All right. And we'll put that in the lines there. So if you're looking to speed up your hiring, drive out bias, make great stuff happen, and learn how to be as smart as what Jeff just dropped on us. My head hurts now. Thanks so much, Jeff. I really appreciate it. Have a great one, and do something about this, everyone. It frustrates me to no end that we say that the team, the people are most important, and that yet we don't invest in them the way that we do other things. So let's really take this and put some application to it. So thanks again, Jeff. I really appreciate it. Have a great one. Thanks, everyone. Oh, my pleasure. All right, get after it. See you, everyone.